In February 1968, a MiG-17 punched holes through Captain Ken Lee's aircraft over the A Shau Valley. His wingman screamed over the radio, and everyone in the military knew one thing for certain. The Army plane Lee was flying was not supposed to have weapons, but it did. And when that MiG crossed in front of him, Lee fired 38 rockets and 100 rounds of .50 caliber machine gun fire. The MiG disappeared into a blind valley, trailing orange fire. Ken Lee had just become the only Army aviator to shoot down an enemy jet since World War II. When he landed, he was ordered to never speak of it again, for 39 years. The OV-1 Mohawk entered the world as a weapon. In June 1956, the Army's official specifications called for an aircraft with greater firepower and heavier armor than anything they had flown before. The Grumman factory mock-up featured underwing pylons for rockets, bombs, and ordnance. The Marines had co-sponsored the program. Everything about this aircraft screamed combat. Then, the Marines pulled out. The Navy redirected their funding. And suddenly, the Army stood alone against an opponent far more dangerous than any enemy in the field: the United States Air Force. In 1948, the Key West Agreement had divided military responsibilities after the Air Force became an independent service. The Air Force received primary responsibility for close air support, tactical reconnaissance, and air superiority. The Army was limited to small observation planes and helicopters. In 1952, the Pentagon imposed an arbitrary 5,000-pound weight limit on Army aircraft. Anything heavier required special permission from the Secretary of Defense. The Mohawk exceeded that limit. It was a political target from the moment it rolled off the assembly line. But here is what defense analyst Mike Pietrucha discovered when he actually read these agreements in a 2019 War on the Rocks analysis. None of them prohibit armed Army fixed-wing aircraft in their written text. Not the Key West Agreement. Not any follow-on memorandum. Not a single one. Pietrucha called the restriction a unicorn. An ugly unicorn. The Army did not disarm the Mohawk because they were legally required to. They disarmed it because they were politically afraid not to. And that fear would cost their pilots everything. April 6, 1966, inside the Pentagon in Washington. Army Chief of Staff General Harold K. Johnson sat down with Air Force Chief of Staff General John P. McConnell for a private negotiation. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs deliberately kept Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara out of the room. He did not want the Navy or Marines weighing in. The terms were brutal. The Army surrendered all CV-2 Caribou and CV-7 Buffalo transport aircraft to the Air Force. Aircraft that had flown 128,000 sorties in 1966 alone. Aircraft that had carried nearly 800,000 passengers. And the Army agreed to strip weapons from all its fixed-wing aircraft. Effective January 1, 1967. In return, the Air Force relinquished claims to Army helicopters. They also promised to provide tactical airlift support whenever the Army needed it. That promise was never kept. The War on the Rocks analysis stated it directly. The promised airlift support never happened. The operational consequences in the jungles of Vietnam were immediate and deadly. Field commanders protested furiously. The official Army history records their frustration. The Mohawks found concentrations of enemy troops who would be gone by the time Air Force strikes could be called in. The Mohawks' intelligence was perishable. An armed Mohawk could have struck immediately. But the Army had traded that capability away for political peace with a sister service. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Alex Peruti summarized what happened. The Air Force would never again complain about armed helicopters, but the Army would strip the weapons off the Mohawks. But one unit refused to comply. Before we get to the pilots who defied the order, you need to understand what the Pentagon took away from them. The Mohawk was tested with weapons that would surprise anyone who thinks of it as a surveillance plane. The armed variants could carry 50-caliber machine gun pods with 750 rounds each, rocket pods with 19 folding-fin aerial rockets, 500-pound bombs, napalm canisters, miniguns, and 40mm grenade launchers. Grumman even proposed mounting a 20mm Vulcan cannon under the fuselage of the aircraft. But the Army also tested something that changes this entire story. They mounted AGM-12 bullpup guided missiles for precision strike capability, and they also tested the AIM-9B Sidewinder air-to-air missile on the Mohawk pylons. That was the same weapon that equipped frontline fighters like the F-4 Phantom. The Mohawk was not just a surveillance platform that happened to carry some rockets. It was tested as a genuine multi-role combat aircraft capable of air-to-air engagement. The AIR force knew this. They demanded Grumman destroy company brochures highlighting the Mohawk's attack capability. A defense contractor was ordered to suppress its own marketing materials to maintain the fiction. In the 11th Air Assault Division tests at Fort Bragg, a full battalion of 30 Mohawk aircraft proved their worth in both reconnaissance and attack roles. When that division deployed to Vietnam as the 1st Cavalry, its Mohawk battalion was stripped away. The Army traded one form of air power for another, and the Mohawk was the price. But the story does not end there. Some pilots kept their weapons anyway. One unit defied the disarmament order completely, the 131st Surveillance Airplane Company, call sign SPUD. They had evolved from a detachment the CIA established in 1964 as a military assistance command Vietnam asset operating outside normal channels. General William Westmoreland himself authorized the 131st to retain armed OV-1A aircraft for self-defense. Their classified missions took them into some of the most hostile airspace in aviation history, over North Vietnam, over Laos, near the Chinese border. Westmoreland authorized their distinctive black flight suits, the only Army aviators in Vietnam so designated. When you saw pilots in black at Phu Bai Airfield, you knew they were SPUDs, and you knew not to ask questions about where they had been. The 131st flew nightly hunter-killer missions. They tracked North Vietnamese Army movements along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They fed intelligence to senior officials in Washington. They were connected to Lima Site 20 Alpha, the most classified airfield in the world at that time, and they paid for it in blood. The predecessor unit deployed with 6 aircraft. They lost 5 in the first 6 months. 7 crew members were killed or went missing. After redesignation, 4 more aircraft were destroyed by the end of 1966. Half the unit's fleet was gone in a single year. 13 pilots and observers were killed or missing in action. The POW network states that missing crews from the 131st represent well over half of all Mohawk losses during the entire Vietnam War. Then the Pentagon ordered them disarmed too. A Stars and Stripes reporter documented what happened next. Captain Dave Critchbaum told him directly. Captain Critchbaum said that as soon as they took the rocket pods off, enemy forces started shooting at them all the damn time. Days after disarmament, the unit lost an aircraft and 2 men to anti-aircraft fire over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But before that order came down, one of their pilots would do something that should have made him famous. February 1968, 2 weeks after the Tet Offensive began. Captain Ken Lee was leading a 2-ship formation of armed OV-1A Mohawks over the A Shau Valley, heading to Laos for target acquisition. Lee's aircraft carried its full combat loadout, 2 rocket pods with 38 total rockets, and 2 50-caliber gun pods. Lee had only recently returned to flight status after being wounded the previous October. A 51 caliber round had penetrated his flak jacket, destroyed his sidearm and survival radio. Now he was back in the cockpit over some of the most dangerous airspace in the war, and a MiG-17 was closing on his tail. The North Vietnamese fighter had slowed to approximately 275 knots to engage the slow-moving Mohawks, far below its maximum speed. It scored hits on Lee's tail section and rear fuselage. Lee's wingman, half a mile back, screamed over the radio, "You got a MiG behind you." But the MiG pilot made a fatal error. He had slowed too much to match the Mohawk's speed. He overshot, sweeping past Lee's left side at roughly 60 feet. Then he turned back for another pass and crossed directly in front of an armed aircraft. Lee fired his rockets in several salvos. Approximately 4 hit the MiG. Then he raked the enemy fighter with roughly 100 rounds of .50 caliber machine gun fire. The MiG's engine died. Its wing dropped. It entered a cloud bank over the valley, emerged trailing red flame, then white smoke, then black smoke, then orange fire. It turned into what Lee knew was a blind valley surrounded by jungle-covered mountains. He was so low, he could not have gotten out of that valley without impacting the hillside. Lee's observer, watching from the rear seat, deposited the contents of his stomach into his helmet bag. When Lee landed at Phu Bai, maintenance crews found bullet holes in his tail, large caliber rounds from the MiG's cannons, not ground fire. Ken Lee had just become the only United States Army aviator to shoot down an enemy jet since World War II. Then came the order that would define the next 4 decades of his life. Do not talk about it, even if asked. Let that sit for a moment. If this story is making you as angry as it makes me, hit subscribe right now. I cover the military stories that institutions try to bury, the stories that deserve to be told, because what the Army did next is even worse. Lee was told flatly not to discuss the engagement with anyone. His wingman received the same order. Lee's explanation, decades later, was simple. The Army was terrified the Air Force would force them to either disarm the Mohawks completely or turn the entire fleet over to the Air Force. An Army airplane shooting down a MiG would expose 2 devastating facts. First, the Army was still flying armed fixed-wing aircraft in violation of the Johnson-McConnell agreement they had signed 2 years earlier. Second, it was performing an air-superiority mission the Air Force considered its exclusive domain. So the Army buried it. They buried their own pilot's greatest achievement to protect themselves from bureaucratic consequences. But Lee found confirmation through an unexpected channel. He had a relationship with Colonel Robin Olds, the legendary Air Force ace commanding the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base. He also had a relationship with Colonel Daniel Chappie James Jr., who would later become the first African-American 4-star general in military history. Lee regularly flew to Ubon to brief Air Force officers on Laotian targets the 131st had identified. Colonel Olds would meet him on the flight line personally, take him to the debrief room with iced Budweiser, and receive intelligence. Weeks after the engagement, Olds told Lee he had heard rumors about a Mohawk downing a MiG over the A Shau Valley. On a later visit, Olds and Chappie James confirmed it. A MiG had definitely been shot down under the exact circumstances Lee described. When Lee asked how they knew, Olds replied, "We know things you guys do not, and will never find out." Air Force Signals Intelligence had independently confirmed the kill. Olds and James then initiated Lee into the MiG Killers Club with a traditional victory sweep around the Ubon Officers Club bar. The Air Force gave Lee the recognition his own service refused to provide. The concealment operated through 5 reinforcing layers that made the cover-up nearly airtight. First, inter-service political agreements. The Key West Agreement and Johnson-McConnell Agreement created institutional incentives for the Army to hide any evidence of fixed-wing combat. Acknowledging success meant risking the aircraft's existence. Second, classification by the CIA. The 131st missions over Laos and North Vietnam fell under the secret war the government officially denied for years. Warrant Officer Gerald Nakel, who flew over 550 combat missions with the unit, wrote that the Army may have manufactured false accounts of how aircraft were lost rather than reveal CIA operations near the Chinese border. Loss locations were deliberately misattributed. Captain Larry Lucas is officially listed as missing in South Vietnam when his lost coordinates place him in Laos. Third, direct orders to silence individual pilots. Lee was told not to discuss it. His wingman received the same order. The entire 131st operated under classification that prevented discussing missions. Fourth, bureaucratic misrepresentation. Armed combat missions were categorized as self-defense even when aircraft carried full offensive loadouts. The distinction was a deliberate fiction. Fifth, suppression of awards. Stars and Stripes reported from 131st pilots directly. Awards are hard to come by in the 131st. Stamp the word secret on an award citation, and it gets lost for sure. The unit had been submitted for a presidential unit citation since 1967. It never came through. During Operation Lam Son 719, while Army, Navy, and Air Force pilots made news around the world, the 131st logged 800 hours over the same combat zones with no mention in any publication. The suppression held for decades, until a handful of people forced the story into daylight. Ken Lee agreed to tell his story publicly, leading to its first publication in 2004 in an aviation history magazine. Wayne Mutza documented the MiG kill in his 2009 book, U.S. Army Aviation in Vietnam. Gerald Nakel published his account of flying 550 missions with the 131st, exposing the CIA connection and systematic concealment. Colonel William Reeder, Jr., a Silver Star recipient who flew armed Mohawks with the 131st, published We Dared to Fly in 2024. The book covers formerly classified missions whose details have only recently been declassified. The OV-1 Mohawk Association, founded by veterans in 1990, has served as the primary civilian repository for the aircraft's history. At annual reunions, they honor the 75 Mohawkers whose names appear on the Vietnam Memorial Wall. 75 names representing missions the official record failed to document. The association exists because the official history was inadequate. Veterans had to create their own institution to preserve what the Army would not. The Mohawk was retired in 1996, after 37 years of service. Its surveillance mission was handed to the Air Force E-8 Joint Stars system. The ultimate institutional irony. The Army's organic battlefield surveillance platform, designed to eliminate dependence on other services, was replaced by an Air Force aircraft, cementing the very dependency the Mohawk was built to prevent. The war zone titled its retrospective, The OV-1 Mohawk, was one of the U.S. military's first forgotten light attack planes. Unlike the Huey helicopter, unlike the F-4 Phantom fighter, unlike even the OV-10 Bronco. The Mohawk never entered popular culture, because the Air Force demanded Grumman destroy marketing materials, because the combat role was deliberately erased, because the Army chose institutional survival over recognizing its pilots. Only about 14 airworthy Mohawks survive today among roughly 31 static displays worldwide. This is not a story about one aircraft. This is not a story about one suppressed kill. This is a story about an institution that was willing to erase its own pilots' achievements to avoid a bureaucratic fight with a sister service. The Army disarmed the Mohawk and silenced Ken Lee not because they had to, but because they chose institutional self-preservation over the truth. Meanwhile, the 131st SPUDs flew into the most dangerous airspace of the war. They lost more crews than all other Mohawk units combined and had their awards stamped secret until they disappeared into filing cabinets in the Pentagon. Ken Lee's flight suit from that day in February 1968 is now displayed at the Fort Novosel Army Aviation Museum in Alabama. From bullet holes over the A Shau Valley to museum glass, the journey took 39 years. 75 names are carved into the black granite of the Vietnam Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C. 75 Mohawk crew members gave their lives flying missions that the official record often failed to document. For half a century, these men were forgotten. Their stories were buried. Their bravery was classified. That ends now. If you believe these pilots deserved better than what their own service gave them, subscribe to this channel. I tell the stories that institutions try to bury. The stories of people who deserved recognition and were denied it. The stories that matter. Hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.